Almost all of Musk's businesses are concentrated in industries that were actively supported and subsidized by the government. And quite often, this support was not just a source of additional financial resources, but also often helps to survive the period that startups call the Valley of Death. This is the period when a business at the beginning of its activity is forced to invest significant funds in development, but at the same time, it does not yet receive income to cover all these costs. And in the case of Musk, all of his main businesses, namely Tesla and SpaceX, were not just startups. This is what is called a capital-intensive business. That is, a business that requires huge capital expenditures at the beginning of its activity. And for this reason, such a business has a fairly long payback period. Therefore, always, without any exceptions, such a business at the beginning of its activity is unprofitable and very dependent on financial support, which can come from various sources. These can be venture investors who believe in the entrepreneur himself and his idea. These can be government programs in the form of various government subsidies. And these can be government contracts or tools that will stimulate demand for the startup's product from the private sector. Let's take the electric car manufacturing business. In fact, the first electric car appeared earlier than a car with an internal combustion engine. However, for a number of reasons, the technology itself did not interest entrepreneurs for quite a long time. And only at the end of the 20th century, against the background of concerns about global warming and other climate changes, an agreement was reached between the governments of different countries on joint efforts to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases that provoke the greenhouse effect. Then, after reaching these agreements, the implementation of practical solutions began by replacing energy sources that create greenhouse gases with alternative, environmentally friendly, and renewable energy sources. And since motor transport, which operated on internal combustion engines, was one of the main sources of emissions, at the government level in various developed countries began to introduce various incentives for the development of electric vehicles. These were incentives for both automakers themselves, to interest them in investing in a new and unpopular direction at that time. And these were incentives for consumers themselves, which allowed buyers of such electric vehicles to receive certain benefits. And here, for example, we can mention California. For many years, this state has been a leader in sales of electric vehicles and provides the lion's share of sales of these cars in the United States. Even now, California provides more than a third of electric vehicle sales in the United States. And this is due not only to the fact that it is the largest in terms of population and one of the wealthiest states in the United States, as well as the efforts of the state itself to develop the electric vehicle market. These efforts consist in the fact that in the territory of California, each individual automaker must ensure a certain percentage of its own sales at the expense of zero-emission cars, even if it does not produce these cars. Moreover, this requirement applies not only to the percentage of electric cars sold, but also to the extent to which these cars meet environmental requirements. Because there are different technologies of electric cars, and these are hybrids, and electric cars with batteries, and electric cars on fuel cells, and each of these cars has a different level of environmental friendliness. Therefore, to control the level of sales of environmentally friendly cars, the so-called ZEV credits were developed, the size of which depends on the environmental friendliness of the car, as well as on other parameters, such as the battery range. And if the manufacturer sells a certain number of cars, then it must earn a certain number of these ZV credits. Well, conditionally, if the company sells 100,000 cars, then it needed 10,000 credits, and one car could receive from 0.5 to 1.5 credits. Tesla's generally received 3-4 credits due to the car's large range. And the most important thing in this slightly confusing scheme is that the manufacturer does not have to earn these credits by selling its own electric cars. It can buy these credits from other manufacturers, and thus it is also considered that it has fulfilled the state requirement. And such a manufacturer, from which other manufacturers constantly bought these credits, was Tesla. Tesla itself always had a surplus of these credits, because they sold only electric cars, so they automatically fulfilled the state requirements. And Tesla used these sales of these excess credits as an additional source of income for the company. In the history of the company, there were even cases when they received losses from their main activities, but having received several billion from the sale of such credits, the company showed a profit. And here it is important to understand that the company received these revenues only due to the fact that the California government actually forced other manufacturers to pay Tesla for these credits. And this is just one example of state support. because in addition, the company receives many other types of state support, both at the state and federal levels. These are subsidies to consumers for the purchase of electric cars. These are subsidies to the company for the construction of infrastructure for charging cars. And also, these are subsidies for the construction of factories. Another example of state support is the company SpaceX. Personally, I have noticed more than once how this company was cited as an example of the success of a private initiative. However, for some reason, the nuance that Musk did not create this company in an empty place remains unnoticed. Well, first of all, such a company requires a scientific and technical base, available specialists, and an education system. And all this infrastructure was created long before Musk appeared as a result of state investments in the aerospace industry, and only because in the 50s, the Soviet Union was the first country to put a satellite into Earth's orbit. And the United States, in order not to lose the initiative in a promising strategic industry, began to actively invest in the development of this direction, despite the lack of commercial attractiveness. And even now, it is precisely these investments in the research and development of space technologies by the state organization NASA that are the main source of income for SpaceX. Yes, of course, SpaceX has many private customers, but NASA still remains their largest customer. And this is just one example, because in addition, SpaceX cooperates with a number of other government agencies. For example, in 2021, the company received a contract from the Ministry of Defense Intelligence to develop spy satellites for almost $2 billion. Also, a significant part of these contracts is classified for obvious reasons. However, even public information is enough to understand that we are talking about several tens of billions of dollars. Therefore, without any exaggeration, we can say that Musk's companies were very dependent on government support.